Chapter 3. That summer, just before St. John's Mass, Gunnulf Nicolausson came back to his cloister. Erland was in the city then for the Froster thing. He sent word to his wife, asking her if she thought she was able to come thither to meet her brother-in-law. Kristin was none too well, but yet she came. When she met Erland, he told her that his brother's health seemed to him quite broken down. They had made but little speed with their undertaking in the north, the friars of Munkefjord. The church they had built they could never get consecrated, for the archbishop could not journey so far north in these unquiet times. They had had to say Mass the whole time at their travelling altar. At length they came to lack both bread and wine and candles and oil for the services. And when Brother Gunnulf and Brother Aslak set sail for Vargoy to fetch these things, the Lapps had cast a spell on them, so that they capsized and had to sit for 3 days and nights on a rocky islet. After this they both fell sick, and Brother Aslak died some time after. They had suffered much from scurvy in the long fast, for they lacked both meal and herbs to eat with the dry fish. Therefore had Bishop Hakon of Bjorgvin and Master Arne, who were at the head of the cathedral chapter at Nidaros while the new Archbishop Sir Paul was gone to the Curia to be consecrated, ordered the monks who yet lived to come back home, and that the priests of Vargoy should tend the flock at Munkefjord till further order. But though she was thus not unprepared, yet was Kristin dismayed when she saw Gunnulf Nicolausson once more. She went with Erland to the cloister the next day, and they were led into the parlour. The monk came in. His form was bent and crooked. The ring of hair was grown quite grey. Under the sunken eyes the skin was wrinkled and dark brown. But on the smooth white skin of the face were lead-coloured spots, and his hand showed similar patches when he drew it out of the sleeve of his gown and held it towards her. He smiled, and she saw that many of his teeth were gone. They sat down and talked a while, but it was as though Gunnulf had forgotten how to speak. He said as much himself before the others left him. "But you, Erland, you are still the same. You don't seem to have grown any older," he said with a little smile. Kristin knew well enough that she herself looked wretchedly just now, and Erland was a comely sight as he stood there tall and slender and dark and richly clad. And yet Kristin thought that he too had changed much. 'Twas strange that Gunnulf didn't see it. He had used to be so sharp-sighted. One day of late summer Kristin was in the clothes loft, and Lady Gunnar of Rasvold was with her. She had come to Huseby to help Kristin, now her lying-in was at hand. Standing there they heard Narkby and Bjorgulf singing out in the courtyard while they sharpened their knives, a coarse ribald song that they were bawling at the top of their voices. Their mother was beside herself with anger. She went down to the boys and chid them with the harshest words. And then she said she must know whom they had learnt such things from. Most like 'twas in the servants' house, but which of the men was it that taught children such things? The boys would not answer. Then Skule came out from under the loft stairway and said Mother had best be still, for they had learnt the song from hearing Father sing it. Lady Gunnar spoke up then. Had they so little fear of God that they could sing such things? And now, when they could not know any night when they lay down to rest, that they might not be motherless before cockcrow? Kristin said no more, but went quietly into the house. Afterwards, when she had lain down for a little on her bed, Narkvi came in and went over to her. He took his mother's hand but said nothing, and then he began to cry quietly. She spoke to him then mildly and jestingly, telling him not to weep or wail. She had won through this trouble 6 times, and surely she would win through the 7th time too. But the boy wept more and more. At last she had to let him creep in between her and the wall, and there he lay weeping with his arms around her neck and his head against her breast. But she could not make him say for what he sorrowed so, though he lay there by her until the serving women bore in the supper. Narkvi was now in his 12th year. He was a great boy for his age, and was most fain to bear himself grown up and manly. But he had a soft heart, and the mother could see sometimes that he was still most childlike. He was old enough to have been able to understand his half-sister's mischance. The mother wondered if he understood too how much since then his father was changed. Erland had always been a man who could say the worst of things when he was enraged. But before this he had never given hard words to any save in wrath, and he had been quick to make all good when he himself was cool again. But now he could say hard and ugly things in cold blood. He had been a terrible man for cursing and swearing, yet he had in some measure left off this evil habit, because he saw it hurt his wife, and gave offence to Sira Eilif, for whom he had grown little by little to feel much respect. But never had he been foul-mouthed or unseemly in his talk. In that matter he had been much more modest than many a man who had led a purer life. Sorely as it hurt Kristin to hear such words on her young son's boyish lips, most of all in the state she was in, and to hear that they had learnt them from their father, there was yet another thing which left the bitterest taste of all in her mouth. She saw that Erland was still childish enough to think he could brave out the shame of his daughter's fall by taking impure and unseemly words on his lips. Frau Gunnar had told her that Margaret had had a stillborn son a while before Olaf's Mass. The lady had come to know, she said too, that Margaret was not so unhappy. She got on well with Gerlach, and he was kind to her. Erland went to see his daughter when he was in the city, and Gerlach made a great to-do of his wife's father, though Erland was none too forward to own the other as kinsman. Erland himself had not mentioned his daughter's name since she had left Huseby. Kristin bore yet another son, and he was christened Munin, after Erland's father's father. In all the time she lay in the little hall, Narkvi came daily in to his mother with berries and nuts he had plucked in the woods, or wreaths of healing herbs that he had plaited. Erland came home when the new son was 3 weeks old. He sat much with his wife and strove to be kind and loving. And this time he made no complaint because the newborn child was not a little maid, or because it was weakly and throve but ill. But Kristin made not much answer to his kind words. She was quiet and sadly brooding, and this time her strength came back to her exceeding slowly. All through the winter Kristin was ailing, and it seemed as though the child would not live and thrive. Thus she had little thought to spare for anything else other than the poor little being, and she heard with but half an ear all the talk of the great tidings that were stirring this winter. King Magnus had fallen into the greatest straits for money by reason of his endeavours to win the lordship over Skarn, and he had called for succour from Norway. Some of the lords of the council were willing to stand by him in this matter. But when his messengers came to Tunsberg, the treasurer had gone away, and Stig Hakonsson, who was governor in Tunsberg Hus, shut the gates of the castle against the king's men, and made ready to hold the place by force of arms. He had few folk with him, but Erling Vidkundsen, who was his uncle by marriage, and was then at his manor in Acre, sent 40 of his men-at-arms to strengthen the fortress, while he himself sailed westwards. Much about the same time, the king's cousins, John and Sigurd Hafthorson, rose against the king, on account of a judgment that had been passed against some of their men. Erland laughed at this, and said the Hafthorsons had shown themselves raw and foolish. There was great discontent now with King Magnus throughout the land. The nobles demanded that a high steward should be put at the head of the affairs of the realm, and the great seal placed in the hands of a Norseman, since the king, for the sake of his affairs in Skåne, seemed minded to spend most of his time in Sweden. The townsmen and the clergy in the cities had been frightened by the rumours of the king's borrowings from the German cities. The haughtiness of the Germans and their flouting of the laws and customs of the land were already greater than could be borne, and now 'twas said that the king had promised them yet greater rights and franchises in Norwegian cities, so that things would become quite unbearable for the Norse traders, who were already hard put to it. Among the commons the rumours concerning King Magnus' secret sin was still widespread, and many of the parish priests and of the wandering monks were at one in this, if in nothing else, that they believed this was the cause why the Olaf's church in Trondheim had burned down. And so the farmers too sought in this the reasons for the many mischances that in these last years had visited now one and now another countryside. Plagues among the cattle, blight in the corn, causing sickness and disease to man and beast, and bad harvests of corn and hay. So Erland said if only the Hafthorsons had had wit enough to hold still a while yet, and win themselves a name for open-handedness and chieftainly dealings, for sure folk would soon have called to mind that they were King Haakon's grandsons too. These disorders quieted down, but the upshot was that the king made Ivar Ogmundson high steward in Norway. Erling Vidkundsen, Stig Haakonsson, the Hafthorsons, and all their following were threatened with attainder of high treason. On this they yielded, came in, and made their peace with the king. There was a powerful man of the uplands named Ulf Saxesson, who had joined in the Hafthorsons' rising, and he did not go with the others to make his peace, but came to Nidaros after Yule. He was much with Erland in the city, and from him the folk north of Dovre had accounts of all these affairs, in the light he saw them in. Kristin greatly mistrusted this man. She didn't know him, but she knew his sister, Helga Saxedatter, who was wed with Gerd Dar of Differen. She was fair, but exceeding proud and haughty, and Simon didn't like her, though Ramborg agreed well with her. Soon after the fast was begun, letters came to the wardens that Ulf Saxesson be proclaimed an outlaw at the Things, but by that time he had left the land, having sailed in the depth of winter. That spring Erland and Kristin were at their townhouse for Easter, and they had their youngest child, Munin, with them, for there was a sister at Bark Cloister who was so skilled in leechcraft that all the sick children who were put in her hands got well, if so be it were not the will of God that they should die. One day, just after the holy day, Kristin came home from the cloister with the little one. The serving man and the maid who had been with her came with her into the hall. Erland was alone there, lying on one of the benches. After the man had gone out and the woman had laid by their cloaks, Kristin had sat down by the fire with the child, and the maid was warming some oil they had gotten from the nun. Erland began asking, from where he lay, what Sister Ragnhild had said of the child. Kristin gave short answers as she sat unwrapping the child's swaddling clothes, and at last she made no answer at all. "Are things so ill with the child, Kristin, that you have no mind to speak of it?" he asked, with a little impatience in his voice. "You have asked this before, Erland," answered his wife coldly, "and I have told you all there is to tell many times. But since you care not enough for the boy to remember it from one day to another—" "It has chanced to me too, Kristin," said Erland, rising and coming over to her, "that I have had to answer you 2 or 3 times about things you yourself had asked of me, because you cared not to remember what I said. They were not things of such import as the children's health, I think," she said in the same tone. "They were not trifles either, this last winter. I at least had then much at heart." "'Tis not true, Erland. 'Tis many a long day since you talked to me of the things you have most at heart." "Get out, Signy," said Erland to the maid. He had flushed to the forehead. Now he turned to his wife. "I do understand what you would speak of. Of that matter I will not speak to you in your serving maid's hearing, even if you are such good friends with her that you count it for nothing that she should be with us when you pick a quarrel with your husband and tell me I speak untrue." "'Tis the last thing a man sees, the beam in his own eye," said Kristin shortly. "I don't know what you mean. I have never spoken ungently to you in strangers' hearing, or forgot to show you all honour and worship before our serving folk." Kristin burst into a strange, heartsick, unsteady laugh. "You are good at forgetting, Erland. Through all these years has Ulf Haldarsson lived with us. Mind you, when you sent him and Haftor to bring me to you in the sleeping loft of Brynhild's house at Oslo?" Erland sank down on the bench, gazing at his wife with parted lips. But she went on. "Many things have befallen at Huseby, or elsewhere, that you have taken little thought to hide from your serving folk. Whether 'twere yourself or your wife, it put to shame." Erland sat still, looking at her in dismay. "Do you remember the first winter we were wed? I was with child of Nakvi. Things were so that 'twas hard enough for me to win obedience and honour from my household. Do you remember how you helped and stayed me? Do you remember when your foster father came to be our guest with strange ladies and maids and men, and our own folk sat at the board with us? Do you remember that Munin dragged off from me every rag I might have hid me with, and you sat mute and dared not to tell him to be quiet? Jesus, have you stored this up against me for 15 years? He looked up at her. His eyes in that glance seemed strangely light blue, and his voice was weak and helpless. Yet, my Kristin, I think 'tis worse than this, that we two should say unfriendly and bitter words to each other. Yes, said Kristin. It was worse indeed, did it cut into my heart, that time at our Yuletide feast, when you chid and rated me because I had thrown my cloak over Margaret. And ladies from 3 counties were standing by and listening. Erland made no answer. And now you blame me because things went with Margaret as they did, when each time I tried to correct her with a word, she would run to you, and you would bid me, in unfriendly words, to let the maid be, for she was yours, and not mine. I have not blamed you, answered Erland in a laboured voice, striving hard to speak calmly. Had one of our children been a daughter, it perhaps may have been easier for you to understand how such things as this befell my daughter, how they pierce a father to the marrow. I thought I had shown you last year that I understood, said his wife in a low voice. I only needed to think of my own father. For all that, said Erland, speaking quietly as before, this was a worse thing. I was an unwed man, This man was wedded. I was not bound. I was not so bound, he corrected himself, that I could never be set free. And yet you did not free yourself, said Kristin. Do you remember how it came to pass that you were set free? Erland sprang up and struck her in the face. Afterward he stood gazing aghast. A red mark came out on her white cheek. But she sat stiff and silent with hard eyes. The child had begun to cry with fear. She rocked it a little in her lap and hushed it. That was cruelly spoken, Kristin, said the man in a shaken voice. Last time you struck me, she said softly, I bore your child beneath my heart. And now you have struck me whilst I sit with your son upon my lap. Yes, these children, we are never without them, he cried impatiently. They fell silent. Erland began walking swiftly up and down the hall. She bore the child into the closet and laid it on the bed. When she came out through the closet door, he stopped in front of her. I should not have struck you, my Kristin. I wish with all my heart I had not done it. I shall repent it, I think, for as long as I repented the last time. But you have taunted me because you think I forget too lightly. But you forget nothing, no single wrong thing that I ever did you. Yet I have tried. I have tried to be a good husband to you. But that I think you don't think worthy of remembering. You are beautiful, Kristin. He looked after her as she went past him. Indeed, the housewife's still and stately bearing was as beautiful as had been the young maid's supple loveliness. Her bosom and hips were grown broader, but she was taller too. She held herself upright, and the neck bore up the little round head proudly and graciously as ever. The pale, close-shut face with its great dark grey eyes stirred and kindled him, even as the round, rosy child face had stirred and kindled his restless soul by its mysterious calm. He went over and took her hand. For me, Kristin, you are and ever will be the most beautiful of all women, and the dearest. She let him hold her hand, but did not give back the pressure of his. Then he flung it from him, as his bitterness overcame him again. You say I have forgotten? I think 'tis not ever the worst of sins, to forget. I never set up to be a pious man, but I remember what I learned of Sir John when I was a child, and God's ministers have reminded me of it ever since. It's a sin to brood and call back to mind the sins we have confessed to the priest and done penance for before God, and been granted his forgiveness through the priest's hand and mouth. And 'tis not from holiness, Kristin, that you are ever tearing open these old sins of ours, but it is to have a weapon against me each time I go against you in anything. He walked away from her and then came back. Greedy to rule. God knows that I love you, Kristin, yet do I see that you are greedy to rule, and never have you forgiven me that I did you wrong and tempted you to wrong. I have borne much from you, Kristin, but I will no longer bear, never to be left in peace for those old mischances, nor to have you speak to me as though I were your thrall. Kristin was shaking with passion as she answered, Never have I spoken to you as though you were a thrall. Have you once heard me speak harshly or angrily to any human being that could be counted as lesser than I? Even if it were the worst and most worthless of all our servant folk. I know myself free before God from the sin of having offended his poor in word or deed. But you should be my master. You should I obey and honour, bow myself before, and stay myself on next to God, according to God's law, Erland. And if so be I have lost patience and have spoken to you in such wise, as it befits not a wife to speak to her husband, I think it has been because you have many a time made it hard for me to bow my simplicity before your better understanding, to honour and obey my husband and lord so much as I fain would have done. And maybe I looked at you, maybe I deemed it, maybe I thought I might spur you on, to show that you were a man, and I but a poor simple woman. But take comfort, Erland. I shall not offend you with my words any more. For after this day I shall never forget to speak to you as gently as though, in truth, you were born of thralls. Erland's face flushed darkly red. He lifted his clenched fist, then turned sharp about on his heel, seized his cloak and sword from the bench by the door, and rushed out. Erland's face flushed darkly red. He lifted his clenched fist. Then he turned sharp about on his heel, seized his cloak and sword from the bench by the door, and rushed out. Outside there was sunshine and a sharp wind. It was cold, but the bright sparkles that besprinkled him from house eaves and from wind-swept trees were drops of water thawed out and frozen again in the air. The snow on the housetops shone like silver, and behind the dark green, tree-clad hills around the town, the mountains glittered cold blue and shining white in the bitter, bright, wintry spring day. Erland passed through streets and lanes, swiftly, haphazardly. He was boiling inwardly. She had been wrong. 'Twas as clear as day. She had been wrong from the first, and he had been right. And he had played the fool and struck her and made him seem less right. But the wrong was with her. What he should do with himself now he didn't know. He had no mind to go to any acquaintance's house, and home he would not go. There was some hurry and bustle in the city. A big trader from Iceland, the first of the year, had come into the wharves in the morning. Erland wandered westward through the lanes, came out by St. Martin's Church, and went down toward the waterside alleys. Though it was early in the afternoon, already there was noise and yelling in the alehouses and from the taverns. In his youth he had been able to go into such houses himself with his friends and fellows. But now all the folks would stare the eyes out of their heads and talk themselves hoarse afterwards if the warden of Orkdola County, with his great house in the city, with ale and meat and wine at home to his heart's desire, should come into an alehouse and ask for a drink of their bad, small beer. Yet truly this was what he had a mind to do, to sit and drink with small farmers in town for the day, and serving men and seamen. There was no to-do when these fellows caught their woman a buffet on the ear, and after that all was well again. Hell and furies! How should a man rule a woman when he cannot thrash her soundly by reason of her birth and his own honour? At bandying words the devil himself could be no match for them. She was a troll, and so fair too. If only he could beat her till she grew good again. The bells began ringing from all the city churches to call folks together to vespers. The spring wind mingled all the notes together in the unquiet air above his head. 'Twas like she was going to Christ Church now, the holy troll. to bemoan her to God and Mary Virgin and holy Olaf that her husband had hit her a buffet on the ear. Erland sent up towards his wife's guardian saints a greeting of sinful thoughts, while the bells clashed and clanged and resounded. He made his way towards St. Gregory's church. His father and mother's graves were before St. Anne's altar in the northern aisle. While he said over his prayers, he caught sight of Lady Sigrid Undset and her maid coming in at the church door. When he had done praying, he went across and greeted her. It had been the way of these two, ever since he had come to know the lady, that whenever they met they fell to somewhat free toying and jesting. And this evening, as they sat on the wall bench waiting for evensong to begin, he was so forward that she had more times than one to remind him that they were in church, and that folk kept coming by them. "Yes, yes," said Erland, "but you are so fair tonight, Signiva. 'Tis so good to jest with a lady that has such gentle eyes." "Little do you deserve, Erland Nicolausson, that I should look at you with gentle eyes," she said, laughing. "Then I will come and jest with you when it is dark," said Erland, laughing too. "When evensong is over I will go home with you." Then the priests came into the choir, and Erland went across to the southern aisle to take his place among the men. When the service was at an end, he went out at the great door. He saw Lady Signiva and her maid a little way down the street, and thought he had best not go with her, but go home straight away. At that moment a band of Icelanders from the trader came up the street. They staggered along, holding on to each other, and seemed as though they would block the two women's passage. Erland ran after the lady. As soon as the sailors saw a gentleman with a sword at his belt come toward them, they swerved aside and made room for the women to pass. "I think I had best go home with you after all," said Erland. "The city is none too quiet tonight." "Can you believe it, Erland? As old a woman as I am, I think I might like it that men think I am so fair 'tis worth while blocking my way." There was but one answer that a courteous man could make to this. He came home to his own house the next morning in the grey of dawn, and stood a little outside the locked door of the hall, frozen, dead-weary, heart-sore, and sickened. Rouse the household with his knocking, go in and creep into bed beside Kristin lying with the child at her breast? No. He had with him the key of the eastern storehouse loft. There were some goods stored there that he was answerable for. He let himself in, pulled off his boots, and got together some webs of wadmal and some empty sacks, and spread them on straw in the bedstead. He wrapped his cloak about him, crept under the sacks, and tired out and harassed as he was able at last to forget everything in sleep. Kristin was pale and weary with waking when she sat down to the morning meal with her housefolk. One of the men told her that he had prayed the master to come to breakfast. He was sleeping up in the east storehouse loft, he said. But Erland had bidden him go to the devil. Erland had a tryst out at Elgesater after the day mass. He had to witness some dealings in land. But he managed to slip away from the feast that followed in the refectory, and also from Arnjvaldsen, who, like himself, could not stay and drink with the brothers, but was set on having Erland go with him to Ranheim. Afterwards he repented that he had parted company with the others. Dismay came over him as he went back alone to the town. Now he must needs think over what he had done. For a moment he had a mind to go straight away to St. Gregory's church. He had leave to confess to one of the priests there when he was in Nidaros. But if he did this again, after he had confessed, the sin would be so much the greater. 'Twere better to wait a while. She must think now, Signiva, that he was a chicken that she had caught with her bare hands. But devil take him if he had ever thought a woman had been able to teach him so much that was new. Here was he going about yawning still from the adventure. He flattered himself he was not unskilled in ars amoris, or whatever the learned men called it. Had he been young and green, like enough he had been proud of himself, and thought it fine and brave. But he didn't like the woman, the mad creature. He was sick of her. He was sick of all women except his wife. And he was sick of her too. By the cross itself, he had been so wedded to her that he had grown most holy himself, for he had believed in her holiness. But it was a fair reward he had had from his holy wife for his faithfulness and love, troll that she was. He remembered her scorching venomous words of the day before. So she thought he bore himself as though he were born of thralls. And the other, Sunniva, she thought doubtless he was nothing but a raw weakling, since he had let himself be taken by surprise, and had shown some dismay at her way of love-making. He would show her now that he was no more of a holy man than she was a woman. He had promised her to come down to Thorolf's townhouse that night, and he might even as well go. The sin was sinned. Why not enjoy any sport it might bring with it? Since he had broken his troth to Kristin already, and she herself had brought it about by her hateful and unjust ways towards him, he went home and wandered about the stables and outhouses seeking for something to find fault with. He had words with the priest serving maid from the hospital because she had brought malt into his drying house, though he knew well that his housefolk would have no use for the house this time while they were in the town. He wished he had had his boys here. They would have been in some company. He wished he could set forth back to Huseby at once, but he had to wait in the city for letters from the south. 'Twas too venturesome to have such things come to hand at one's home in the country. The mistress of the house didn't come in to supper. She was lying down on the bed in the closet, said Signy, her maid, looking at her master reproachfully. Erland answered harshly that he had not asked after his mistress. When the housefolk had left the hall, he went into the closet. It was pitch dark in there. Erland bent over the bed. "Are you weeping?" he asked very low. Her breath came so strangely. But she answered in a thick, husky voice that she was not weeping. "Are you weary?" "I will go to rest too now," he said in the same low voice. Kristin's voice quivered as she said, "Then I would prefer, Erland, that you go and lie tonight where you lay last night." Erland made no answer. He went out and fetched the candle from the hall into the closet and opened his chest of clothing. He was well clad enough already to go wherever he wanted, for he still bore the violet cottardie he had worn at Egelsetter in the morning. But now he changed his clothes slowly and deliberately, put on a red silk shirt and a mouse-grey knee-long velvet coat, with little silver bells on the sleeve points, brushed his hair and washed his hands. Time and again he looked over towards his wife. She lay silent and motionless. Then he went out without bidding good night. Next day he came home openly at the breakfast hour. So things went on for a week. Then Erland came home one evening from Hangra, where he had been on an errand, and learnt that Kristin had ridden off that morning home to Huseby. It had grown clear to him already that never had any man had less joy from a sin than he had from these dealings of his with Sunniva Olafsdatter. In his heart he was so deadly weary of the crazy creature, sick of her even while he caressed and toyed with her. 'Twas a mad and reckless thing, too. Like enough it was all over the town and the countryside by now that he had his nightly resort in Thorolf's house, and to smirch his name for Sunniva's sake. Now and then he had thought, too, that the thing might raise some trouble. The woman had a husband, such as he was, old and sickly. 'Twas pity of Torolf that he should be wed to such a wild and witless woman. Most like he was not the first that had made free with the husband's honour. And Haftor, he had clean forgotten, when he had to do with Sunniva, that she was Haftor's sister. He remembered it only when it was too late. Everything was as bad as it could be, and now he could see that Kristin knew it. She surely could not take it into her head to bring suit against him before the Archbishop, crave leave to depart from him. She had Jorungard to take refuge in, but it was impossible to travel thither over the mountains at this time of the year. Quite impossible if she would take the small children with her, and Kristin would not leave them. No, he thought, to comfort himself. And she could not go by sea either, with Munin and Lavrans so early in the spring. But 'twould be unlike Kristin to crave the Archbishop's help against him, though she had good reason for it. But he would keep away from her bed of his own accord, till she saw that he repented from his heart. Kristin could never wish to have this thing publicly brought to question, but he knew in his heart that 'twas long since he had rightly known what his wife could and could not do. He lay at night in his own bed, letting his thoughts go hither and thither. It dawned upon him that he had behaved yet more witlessly than he had understood at first, to let himself be tangled in this wretched adventure, now when he was in the thick of the greatest plans of the state. He cursed himself that he was still such a fool about his wife that she had been able to drive him to this. He cursed both Kristin and Sunniva. In the devil's name, sure he was no fonder on women than other men. Rather he had had to do with fewer of them than most others that he knew of. But 'twas as though the foul fiend himself had the ordering of things for him. He could not come near a woman without finding himself up to the neck in a bog. There should be an end of it now. God be thanked and praised that he had other things in hand. Soon, for sure, he would have Lady Ingeborg's letters. In that matter, too, he had to reckon with women's whims. Perhaps that was God's punishment for the sins of his youth. Erland laughed to himself in the dark. The lady must see that things were as they had so clearly set them forth to her. The question was whether it should be one of her sons or the sons of her base-born sister that the Norsemen set up against King Magnus. And she loved her children by Nut Pors as she had never loved her other children. Soon 'twould be the sharp wind and the salt sea breakers that should fill his embrace. God in heaven, it would be good to be drenched by the waves once again, and have the wind blow freshness to his very marrow, be quit of all womankind for a long, delicious time. Sunniva, she could think whatever she liked. Thither he would go no more. And Kristin might fare to Jorungard if she would, for him. Perhaps it would be best and safest for her and the children if they were well out of the way in Gudbrandsdal this summer. Afterward there was no fear, but he could make friends with her again. Next morning he rode up into Skåne. Say what he would, he could not rest till he had made sure what his wife meant to do. She met him with gentle, cold courtesy when he reached Huseby late in the day. She didn't say a word to him of her own accord, nor an unfriendly word, and she said nothing against it when, in the evening, as if feeling his way, he came over and lay down in their bed. When they had lain together a while, he tried, falteringly, to lay a hand on her shoulder. Kristin's voice shook, but Erland could not tell whether it were in sorrow or from anger, as she whispered, "So base a man I think you are not, Erland, that you would make this worse for me than it need be. I cannot strive with you, with our children sleeping around us, and since I have 7 sons by you, I would be loath that our housefolk should see that I know I am a wronged wife." Erland lay long and silent before he ventured to answer. "God have mercy on me, Kristin. I have wronged you. I had not done it if I could have taken more lightly the cruel words you said to me that day at Nidaros. It is not so that I am come home to beg you for forgiveness, for I know well that that would be too great a thing to ask you now. I see that Munin Bardson spoke true," answered his wife. "The day will never come when you will stand up and take the blame on yourself for what you have done wrong. 'Twere best you turned to God and sought to make your peace with him. You have less need to ask my forgiveness than his." "Ah, that much I can see," said Erland bitterly. After this they spoke no more, and the next morning he rode back to Nidaros. He had been in the city some days when Lady Suneva's woman came to him one evening at St. Gregory's Church. It seemed to Erland that after all it were well he should speak with the lady one last time, and he bade the girl keep watch that night. He would come by the same way as before. He had had to creep and clamber about like a poultry thief to come up into the loft where they had their meetings. It made him sick with shame now to think he had been such a fool, a man of his age and his place. But at first he had thought it a sport to play such youthful pranks. The lady was in bed when he came in. "Have you come at long last, and so late?" She laughed and yawned. "Quick, now, come to bed, and we can talk afterward about where you have been so long." Erland knew not rightly what to do, or how to tell her what he had at heart. Without thinking, he began to loose the fastenings of his dress. "Foolhardy is it, this, that we have done, Suneva? I think it would be well that I did not stay here tonight. Thorolf must be coming home soon," he said. "Are you frightened at my husband?" asked Suneva teasingly. "You saw yourself Thorolf never so much as pricked up an ear when we toyed and jested before his very eyes. Should he hear that you have been coming about the house, I warrant I will make him believe that 'is but the old foolery. He trusts me all too well." "Ah, it seems indeed that he does trust you all too well," laughed Erland, burying his fingers in the bright hair on her firm white shoulders. "Do you say so?" She caught him round the wrist. "Yet you must trust your wife too, and I was yet modest and shamefast when Bard wedded me." "My wife we will leave outside of this matter," said Erland sharply, letting go his hold. "Why so? Think you 'tis more unseemly that we should speak of Kristin Lavransdatter than of Sir Thorolf, my husband?" Erland set his teeth hard and made no answer. "I think you are one of those men, Erland," said Suneva mockingly, "that think you are so winning and fair that it can scarce be reckoned a fault in a woman that her virtue was as frail as glass against you. She may be staunch as steel against all others." "Of you I have never thought so," answered Erland coarsely. Suneva's eyes gleamed. "What do you want with me then, Erland, since you were so happily wedded?" "I have said, don't talk about my wife." "Your wife or my husband?" "It was always you that began to speak of Thorolf, and 'twas you that scoffed at him worst," said Erland bitterly. "And if you had not flouted him in words, 'twas plain enough how dear you held his honour when you took another man to you in your husband's place." She is not brought low by my misdoing. Is this what you would say to me? That you love Kristin, though you like me well enough to play with me? I don't know how well I like you. You showed that you liked me. And Kristin doesn't value your love at its true worth, she scoffed. I have seen well enough how gently she is used to look on you, Erland. Hold your tongue now, shouted the man. Maybe Kristin knew what I deserved, he said, harshly and savagely. You and I may well be too much alike. Is that it? Asked Sunniva threateningly. That I was to be nothing but a whip for you to lash your wife with? Erland stood, breathing hard. Call it so, if you like. But you laid yourself ready to my hand. Beware, said Sunniva, that whip doesn't hit you as well. She sat up in the bed and waited. But Erland offered not to gainsay her or to seek to make up the quarrel. He redressed fully and left her without a word. He was not greatly pleased with himself or with the fashion in which he had parted from Sunniva. There was small honour in it for him. But it could not be helped, and at least he was quit of her now.